Hello, welcome to what I consider to be the most fun bit of looking at the London Naval Conference and Treaty of 1930. What if they fail to make any sort of agreement? So I've been working on this with Alex Clarke. I would highly recommend you go and find him on YouTube, on Twitter as @AC_Naval History. He podcasts the bilge pumps via SimSec, which you can find at the podcast provider of your choice, or on Apple if you're part of the iCult. He's got a Discord that's very friendly, and he does Patreon. So it wouldn't be a fun counterfactual history bordering into speculative fiction if I didn't have a war to discuss with what would happen with the different war options. How would these things do? What would be the consequences? All that kind of thing. What would it trigger? So my thought process along here is it's going to be a Pacific War. It's going to happen in 37 or 38. I haven't worked out which. I think either is a distinct possibility. I'll explain. So the financial cost of this arms race that's going to continue, that was kind of stopped by the London Naval Treaty in 1930, that's going to have hurt the Japanese financially. Now, in real life, they invaded Manchuria in 1931. And this generated, a bit of tutting and, that's naughty, from the League of Nations, which didn't really have any effect. And actually, Manchuria has pretty much all the things that Japan wants if they can get it developed. It's got oil, it's got coal, it's got iron, it's got aluminium, it's got rivers for generating hydroelectricity for doing your aluminium processing, it's got agricultural land. It's really has a lot of potential, and I think they underexploited it in real life, in real history. So they're busy doing that, but since World War I, at the very least, if not kind of for forever, since there was a concept of Japan and China, and people were living on them, and they were encountering each other at all, there has been a should we say, difference of opinion about who should be running who, and each one thinks they should be running the other. And at the moment, Japan is in the ascendancy because China is kind of tearing itself apart in civil wars and things. So Japan wants to take over and run more of China. And in real history, they would go on to start the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. Now, we're now in this different 1937 or 38, so the shipbuilding programs, capital ship limits have come off, but no one's really going to be in a position to truly exploit that with anything built without having been really very naughty. And I think even the Japanese are going to struggle to have a really significant material difference here. In terms of the Washington Naval Treaty having expired. The League of Nations by this stage has been shown to be pretty much completely impotent. You've had nothing really happening when Japan invaded Manchuria. You've had the Abyssinia crisis when Italy invaded Ethiopia. Again, nothing happened really. League of Nations is starting to look increasingly creaky because the US has never joined. Germany's walked out. Italy, I think, have walked out or are in the process of walking out. And Japan will walk out or have walked out. So the League of Nations is kind of crumbling as a thing, and is very much impotent. Now, the key difference is that the US really doesn't want Japan to take over China. I think the British don't either, or the British Empire doesn't either, which I'll get onto in a second. But the US sort of is really unhappy with what's happening in China, and will get even more unhappy as time goes by. And the US is also, especially now the gloves are coming off, and also with the lag between design, ordering, building, and commissioning, the US's vast hordes of New Orleans class cruisers are about to hit the water in the sorts of numbers that means that the Japanese are not going to be able to remain competitive. So things are only going to get worse in terms of planning to launch a strike against the US from this point on. And I don't think there's any realistic chance of another naval or peace treaty of any sort coming along. Briefly, to talk about the British Empire's position on China. Now, slightly complicated. At the end of World War I and going into the 1922 Washington Treaty and all of those sorts of things, Britain had opted to go with alliance with the US over an alliance with Japan. It had opted to kind of sign up to the American sets of things rather than going with the continuation of the Anglo-Japanese Treaty. Then Japan is looking aggressive. Britain has interest in China, but in the same way that Britain viewed South America in this sort of era, Britain wants a China that is stable and can be traded with, but is finally learning to control organisations like the dishonourable East India Company, who accidentally gave them an empire. Britain doesn't really want an empire. Britain wants trade partners. So Britain does not want Japan, who by this stage are really very isolationist, inward-looking, nationalistic, does not want Japan taking over all of China, because that will mean that all of China is now going to be buying Japanese stuff. We want them to have the option of buying British. The Americans want them to have the option of buying American. Now, Japan viewed Britain as being not such a threat to their expansion. I think that's probably the way that the British were quite so spread out in terms of their imperial interests. The fact that there's not a secure base of any sort to threaten the Japanese in quite the same way. It's just a bit of a different thing, but that's the way the Japanese view it. I actually think Britain is not going to be particularly happy with these ideas. That's just coming on to things. So, what are the Japanese going to do? They're going to launch a sudden strike. It's going to be a surprise. They're going to seize the initiative. How do we know this? Because it's what the Japanese frickin' always do. Since Tsushima in 1904. That's what they do. Maybe this time, unlike with what happened with Pearl Harbor, they will manage to get their diplomat to hand over the declaration of war, I would say between 30 to 60 seconds before. Actually, no, this is 1930, so technology for communication isn't that brilliant. I'd aim to do it a full 5 minutes before the attack goes in or is spotted by the Americans. The US Navy in around April, May sort of time has been holding its fleet problems, and in 1937 and 1938 they've got fleet problems 18 and 19, which are kind of taking place to a fairly large extent around the Pacific and as far west as Hawaii and Midway Island. So they're concentrated, they've come to meet the Japanese. That all looks pretty awesome. If Japan's going with this plan, rather than what actually happened, which kind of seems to be that the Sino-Japanese War started by accident, or was started by the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, despite the best efforts of Japanese High Command to stop it. This time, with a more coordinated plan, I think that at that point Japan's army is going to launch into the main bit of China. So you're going to have the Navy take out the Americans, control the ocean, then be able to pull back and prevent anyone else from resupplying the Chinese side, and they're then going to attack China that way. Now, quite how this is all going to go, I'm not sure. I think they are planning without the British doing anything. I think the Japanese mindset might have been that they they saw themselves as the Britain of the East, and I think they assumed that that would be reciprocated. I don't think it was reciprocated. Yeah, so how do I think the Japanese will do attacking the Americans? It's really hard to say. The idea with Pearl Harbor is that they managed, and the attack there is that they managed to catch the US fleet in harbor. They managed to avoid the big battle and really do a good job of thinning down the American battle fleet, which has always been the Japanese strategy, was to thin down the enemy. By enemy we mean US Navy fleet, to the point where they could then take it on a peer-to-peer level, because they were a bit like the British and thought that one of our ships is better than one of the American ships. Frankly, if you're talking about the 21 knot American battleships, when you've still got quite a lot of 12 and 14-inch gun-armed ones, I don't necessarily think the Japanese are wrong. As you get more of the American fast battleships coming through, my personal fast battleships, the CD, EF, GH, as I'm going to call them, it's a bit different. But the really nice thing here is that you've got earlier generation aircraft on both sides, but probably even worse anti-aircraft firepower. You don't have radar, although radar picking up the radar on Pearl Harbor did diddly squat. But you're going to have a big battle, and that's a fun one to kind of war game out, but I won't bore you with what I think happened with that, if only because I can't do anything with the graphics to make it work. Plus, I haven't actually worked that one through in my head yet. So, what does everyone else do? By which I mean, will the British Empire join in fighting the Japanese? To which I firmly believe the answer is, yes, I think they will. And no, I don't think the Japanese are going to like that one bit. Because the British plan from before the Washington Naval Treaty was to recognise the similarities with Japan, that the Japanese merchant fleet was vulnerable. So that's going to go away with British submarines, with British cruisers, British Empire cruisers, sorry, Dominion cruisers, the Australian Navy, the New Zealand Navy, the Canadian Navy. Actually, the Canadian Navy may well be donated to help the US Navy. Potentially, my geography is not good enough to work out whether the South African Navy would sortie into the Indian Ocean and move north that way to meet up with everyone around Singapore, or whether they would actually go for either going around the Cape and going from South Atlantic to South Pacific, or whether they would head for the Panama Canal to again link up with the American, possibly forces on the West Coast, which would be whatever's left on from the West Coast and East Coast that didn't go to the fleet problem and things like that. The Royal Navy is going to mobilise the Mediterranean and home fleets. They're going to be sailing in their immensitude. Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be a quite different war, because also the Japanese are not embedded, so what had happened in real history is the Japanese launched their attacks in late 1941, by which time they were 4 years into fighting in China. That's got pluses and minuses. They were a lot closer to places like Hong Kong and things to threaten them. Instead, they're still going to be quite a long way from Hong Kong, although they have controlled Formosa or Taiwan, same place, for quite a long time, and they've controlled Korea for a long time now. So they've got those assets to forward base things to take on the British coming from the West. But they're really not in a position to threaten even Hong Kong, which is undefendable, let alone Singapore. They're not going to be able to touch the Dutch East Indies for the oil there. They're not going to be looking at the Philippines. Yeah, it's an interesting, different war in that it's earlier. The Americans don't have all of the things that are coming online in late 1941, whether because it's a recognition of the inevitability of war and just that the whole world is going big and bad, and they're building for the Royal Navy's and Britain's, and the Allies' side, and they've been gearing up to become the factory, if not fighting. World War II for a couple of years. All of that is not going to be happening for the US. The US is going to be starting cold. But it's a different cold. And it's a different cold for the British as well, who have potentially, if they're clever with how they've used Dominion navies and things, been able to actually achieve what they wanted. And that whilst the Japanese have got kind of what they wanted, albeit an inferiority in numbers of capital ships, and they're only going to be able to be replaced, where the Royal Navy and the US Navy are building 2 new capital ships a year, coming into service from 1934, 35, 36, maybe 37. The Japanese are only able to replace 1, so they've maybe got rid of the Congo class. They're sneaky, and I can see them delaying truly dismantling, getting rid of the Congo class for a while, and possibly secretly rebuilding them at this stage. So they might have the Congo class plus, let's call them the Congo class successors, to use, but yeah, it's not really going to be quite the same. It's going to be interesting. This is definitely one to talk through with somebody else and think through and possibly try and wargame. So, thank you very much for listening with all of those. I really appreciate your time if you've bothered. I'm still very new to doing any of this. I'm putting this together with PowerPoint to give you an idea. So constructive feedback on production is hugely appreciated. Similarly, content. I'm going to try releasing this in both chunks, broken up, and also as one giant, nearly 2-hour long thing. I don't really expect anyone to watch the 2-hour thing, but it's definitely, given that I'm only using a few slides, something that you could listen to more, perhaps, shall we say. Think of it more like a podcast. I just have no idea how to do a podcast. So that's it for this whole one. I'd like to direct you once again to Alex Clarke. So that's Dr. Alex Clarke on YouTube. That's AC_Naval History on Twitter. If you find his page on the YouTube stuff, you can find links to his Discord and his Patreon servers, and you can also listen to him and Drakenfell, the other Alex from Southwest London, with links to Kingston University, and Jamie, who runs the Awesome Armoured Carriers YouTube video and site. You can get them talking on Bilge Pumps, which is hosted by CIMSEC, the Centre for International Maritime Security, which is itself an awesome kind of charitable organisation that I would wholeheartedly recommend and commend to you all to check out as well. And that's me, signing off. Dan Friedman, GCSE in History, although I did get an A, but that was an awfully long time ago. Oh well.